German East Africa existed for barely 3 decades, from 1885 to 1919. It was a latecomer to the colonial scramble, carved hastily from territories that had thrived for millennia. Yet this brief German episode transformed the region profoundly, leaving scars and structures that shaped modern Tanzania, Rwanda and Burundi. To understand what the Germans destroyed and created, we must first understand what existed before they arrived. Ancient kingdoms, sophisticated trading networks, proud peoples with their own histories stretching back centuries. This is not a story of empty wilderness waiting for European civilization. This is a story of collision between worlds, where complex African societies met the brutal machinery of European imperialism. Long before any German set foot in East Africa, the coast was home to one of Africa's most sophisticated civilizations. The Swahili people, a fusion of Bantu African and Arab cultures, built magnificent stone cities along the Indian Ocean coast. Kilwa, Zanzibar, Mombasa, Lamu. These weren't primitive villages but cosmopolitan trading centres with multi-storey buildings, elaborate mosques and bustling markets. The Swahili civilization emerged around 1000 CE, born from centuries of trade between African peoples and merchants from Arabia, Persia and India. Monsoon winds made regular contact possible. Ships sailed southwest with the winter monsoons, northeast with the summer ones. This created a maritime highway connecting East Africa to the broader Indian Ocean world. Swahili cities grew wealthy from trade. They exported ivory, gold, enslaved people, and various African products. They imported cloth, ceramics, and luxury goods from Asia. The elites lived in stone houses with indoor plumbing, wore silk and fine cotton, and ate from Chinese porcelain. They spoke Swahili, a Bantu language enriched with Arabic vocabulary, and wrote it using Arabic script. They were predominantly Muslim, though African religious practices persisted beneath the Islamic surface. These city-states were independent, ruled by local sultans or councils of merchants. They competed and cooperated, formed alliances and fought wars, just like Italian city-states or German principalities. By the 15th century, Kilwa Kisiwani was perhaps the wealthiest city in sub-Saharan Africa, controlling gold trade from Zimbabwe's interior. The Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama, visiting in 1502, described Kilwa as rivaling anything in Europe. Inland from the coast, the territory that would become German East Africa was home to hundreds of distinct peoples, speaking different languages, practicing different customs, organised into chiefdoms, kingdoms, and stateless societies. The diversity was enormous. This wasn't a single culture, but a patchwork of human societies adapted to different environments and challenges. In the highlands around Lake Victoria, powerful kingdoms had emerged. Buganda, though mostly outside what became German, East Africa, influenced the region. Rwanda and Burundi were hierarchical kingdoms with complex social structures. The Tutsi minority ruled over the Hutu majority, a system that predated European colonialism, though Europeans would later exacerbate these divisions catastrophically. The Central Plateau was home to various Bantu-speaking peoples. The Nyamwezi controlled important trade routes from the interior to the coast. They were skilled traders, providing porters and guides for caravans. The Hehe, under their leader Mkwawa, built a powerful centralised state in the southern highlands in the 1850s, 1870s. The Chaga people around Mount Kilimanjaro had developed sophisticated irrigation systems for their banana plantations. Further south, the Yao and Makonde peoples had their own political structures. Some societies were centralised kingdoms with hereditary rulers. Others were acephalous, without formal chiefs, governed by councils of elders, age sets, or clan leaders. This diversity made the region hard to conquer and harder to govern. There was no single ruler to defeat, no capital to capture that would bring the whole territory under control. In the early 19th century, a new power arose, the Omani Sultanate based in Zanzibar. Omani Arabs had been trading with East Africa for centuries, but in 1832 Sultan Sayyid Said moved his capital from Muscat to Zanzibar, recognizing the island's strategic and economic importance. Under Omani rule, Zanzibar became the center of an expanding commercial empire. The Sultan claimed authority over much of the coast and sent traders, tax collectors, and slavers into the interior. Clove plantations were established on Zanzibar and Pemba Islands, worked by enslaved Africans. The slave trade, always part of Swahili commerce, intensified dramatically. Arab and Swahili traders penetrated deep into the interior, establishing trading posts, making alliances with the local chiefs, and capturing or buying enslaved people to sell on the coast. This period saw the rise of powerful Arab Swahili traders like Tipu Tip, who built a personal empire in the Congo Basin, controlling vast territories and commanding thousands of armed followers. These traders brought firearms, cloth, and other goods to the interior, exchanging them for ivory and enslaved people. Their caravans, sometimes thousands strong, moved along established routes, transforming the interior's economy and politics. The Omani presence wasn't formal colonialism in the European sense. The Sultan didn't establish bureaucratic administration or try to remake African societies. His interest was commercial, extracting wealth through trade, especially ivory and slaves. Local African rulers remained in place, though some became dependent on Arab traders for firearms and luxury goods. In the mid-19th century, European explorers began penetrating the African interior. Britain and other European powers had outlawed the slave trade and wanted to suppress it, though their motives mixed humanitarianism with imperialism. They were also curious about Africa's geography. The source of the Nile remained a mystery. Richard Burton and John Speke reached Lake Tanganyika in 1858. Speke identified Lake Victoria as the Nile source, though Burton disputed this. David Livingstone, the Scottish missionary explorer, crossed the region multiple times, mapping lakes and rivers while preaching Christianity and denouncing the slave trade. When he disappeared in the interior, journalist Henry Morton Stanley found him in 1871 at Ujiji on Lake Tanganyika, uttering the famous line, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume?" These explorers' accounts shaped European perceptions of Africa. They described vast territories, abundant resources, peoples needing civilization, and opportunities for commerce and missionary work. They portrayed the slave trade's horrors, though they often exaggerated or misunderstood what they saw. Their books became bestsellers, creating public interest in Africa and inadvertently paving the way for colonial conquest. Stanley, after Livingstone's death, undertook expeditions sponsored by King Leopold II of Belgium and various newspapers. His ruthless methods, he fought numerous battles with African peoples who resisted his intrusions, foreshadowed the violence of the colonial era. But his maps and reports provided concrete information that European powers would use to claim and partition Africa. By the 1880s, European powers were competing for African territories. France, Britain, Portugal, and Belgium had established footholds. Germany, recently unified under Bismarck, wanted its place in the sun. Italy and Spain harboured colonial ambitions. Conflict seemed inevitable. In 1884-1885, German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck convened the Berlin Conference. Representatives from European powers, plus the United States, met to establish rules for claiming African territories. No Africans attended. They weren't consulted about the future of their continent. The conference established the principle of effective occupation. A European power claiming territory had to demonstrate actual control, not just historical claims or exploration. This sparked the scramble for Africa as European powers rushed to establish administration, sign treaties with African rulers, and plant flags before rivals did. Germany, entering the game late, moved aggressively. German explorers, adventurers, and businessmen were already active in East Africa. Karl Peters, founder of the Society for German Colonization, signed dubious treaties with local chiefs in 1884, acquiring vast territories for Germany. These treaties, often signed by chiefs who didn't understand what they were agreeing to or lacked authority to cede land, became the basis for German claims. In 1885, German Chancellor Bismarck granted Peters' Society a charter to administer these territories. The German East Africa Company was born, with authority to govern, raise taxes, maintain order, and exploit resources. The Sultan of Zanzibar protested. He claimed sovereignty over the coastal areas, but Germany and Britain forced him to accept German control of the mainland while keeping Zanzibar. By 1885, on paper, Germany controlled a vast East African territory. In reality, it controlled almost nothing. A few coastal towns had German officials and small garrisons. The interior remained under African rule, suspicious of or hostile to German pretensions. The Swahili merchants resented German interference in their trade. The Arab Swahili elite saw Germans as rivals threatening their dominance. For ordinary Africans, farmers, herders, fishermen, life continued largely unchanged. They had seen outsiders come and go before. The Portuguese had come and gone. Arab traders came and went. These Germans would be another group trying to extract wealth, likely to be resisted where necessary and accommodated where beneficial. But the Germans were different. They came not just to trade but to rule, to transform, to impose their vision of civilization. They brought modern weapons, efficient bureaucracy, racial ideology, and unwavering confidence in their superiority. The collision between German imperialism and East African societies would be catastrophic, reshaping the region forever. The German East Africa Company arrived with grand ambitions but limited resources. They expected African chiefs to accept German authority peacefully, trade to flow smoothly, and profits to follow naturally. Reality proved brutally different. The coast erupted in rebellion. Interior peoples fought fiercely against German intrusion. The company, overwhelmed and bankrupt, had to be rescued by the German government, which responded with military force. What followed was over a decade of savage warfare, with Africans fighting desperately to preserve their independence and Germans using increasingly brutal methods to impose control. By 1898, German rule was established, but at enormous cost in African lives and through methods that foreshadowed the horrors to come. German efforts to impose control began at the coast, where they tried replacing Arab Swahili administrators with German officials and claiming customs revenues. This threatened the economic and political power of the coastal elite, who had dominated trade for generations. In August 1888, Abu Shiri ibn Salim, an Arab Swahili leader, led a rebellion that quickly spread along the entire coast. The uprising united diverse groups. Arab and Swahili merchants resented German interference in trade. Muslim religious leaders opposed Christian rule. Ordinary people feared German taxation and forced labour. Within weeks, Germans controlled only a few fortified positions. Bagamoyo, Tanga, Kilwa, and other coastal towns were besieged or captured by rebels. German officials fled to offshore islands or were killed. The company couldn't suppress the rebellion. Its forces were too small, its resources exhausted. German public opinion was shocked. This was supposed to be a profitable commercial venture, not a war. Chancellor Bismarck, initially reluctant to commit government resources, had no choice. In 1889, he dispatched Captain Hermann von Wissmann with modern weapons, professional soldiers, and authority to crush the rebellion by any means necessary. Wissmann's campaign was ruthless. He recruited African mercenaries, armed them with modern rifles, and employed scorched earth tactics. Villages suspected of supporting rebels were burned. Prisoners were executed. After months of fighting, Abu Shiri was betrayed, captured, and publicly hanged in December 1889. His death broke the rebellion's back. By 1890, German control over the coast was restored, though at the cost of thousands of lives and enormous expense. The uprising demonstrated that African resistance would be fierce and conquest expensive. The German East Africa Company, financially ruined, transferred its charter to the German government in 1891. German East Africa became an official imperial colony, administered directly from Berlin with military support. Inland, the most formidable resistance came from the Hehe people under their brilliant leader Chief Mkwawa. The Hehe had built a powerful centralized state in the southern highlands, with a disciplined army equipped with firearms obtained through trade. Mkwawa, intelligent and charismatic, understood that German expansion threatened Hehe independence and acted accordingly. In August 1891, a German expedition under Lieutenant Emil von Zelewski marched into Hehe territory with 320 African soldiers and several German officers. Zelewski, arrogant and dismissive of African military capabilities, ignored warnings about Hehe strength. At Lugalo, Mkwawa ambushed the column with over 3,000 warriors. The Germans were annihilated. Zelewski and all German officers were killed, most African soldiers died, and weapons and ammunition were captured. It was the worst German defeat in East Africa. The defeat shocked Berlin. More troops were dispatched. But conquering the Hehe proved difficult. Their fortified capital, Kalenga, was surrounded by defensive works. Hehe warriors fought with skill and courage. Mkwawa employed guerrilla tactics when conventional battles proved costly. For 7 years he resisted. In 1894, the Germans finally stormed Kalenga after a brutal siege. Mkwawa escaped with his remaining forces and continued guerrilla warfare for 4 more years. Living in the bush, moving constantly, he harassed German positions and inspired continued resistance. Finally, in June 1898, surrounded by German forces, Mkwawa shot himself rather than be captured. The Germans took his head as a trophy, sending it to Germany, a macabre symbol of colonial brutality. Throughout the 1890s, Germans systematically conquered the territory. Each region presented different challenges. The Chaga around Kilimanjaro fought from mountain strongholds. The Nyamwezi resisted German disruption of their trading networks. The Ngoni in the south, militaristic and organized, required sustained military campaigns to subdue. German methods were consistently brutal. Villages refusing submission were destroyed, crops burned, cattle seized. Collective punishment was standard. Entire communities suffered for one chief's resistance. German officers competed for glory, leading aggressive expeditions that often provoked conflict where peaceful accommodation might have been possible. Technology gave Germans decisive advantages. Maxim guns, early machine guns, could fire 600 rounds per minute, mowing down charging warriors armed with spears or outdated firearms. Artillery shattered fortifications that had protected African kingdoms for generations. Telegraph lines allowed Germans to coordinate campaigns over vast distances. Railways, though limited, moved troops rapidly to trouble spots. But African resistance was formidable. Warriors fought with desperate courage, knowing defeat meant subjugation. Some adopted guerrilla tactics that frustrated German forces. Others formed alliances, though German diplomacy often successfully divided potential coalitions. The terrain, mountains, forests, vast distances, aided defenders who knew the land. By 1898, organised resistance was largely crushed, though sporadic rebellions continued. The cost was staggering. Thousands of Africans died in combat. Many more died from famine caused by German scorched earth tactics and crop destruction. Diseases spread as populations were displaced and traditional social structures disrupted. Exact numbers are unknown, but some regions lost significant percentages of their population. The conquest also destroyed political systems that had existed for generations. Chiefs who resisted were killed or exiled. Those who collaborated often lost legitimacy in their people's eyes. traditional authority structures were replaced with German-appointed chiefs, usually chosen for compliance rather than legitimacy. This created political chaos that would last decades. The slave trade, which Germans claimed to be suppressing, was indeed ended, though Germans used forced labour extensively. Arab Swahili merchants lost their dominance, though some adapted by becoming intermediaries for German rule. The old Omani commercial empire was dismantled. The Swahili coastal cities, once proud and independent, became provincial towns in a German colony. With military conquest largely complete, Germans began building administrative structures. The territory was divided into districts, each under a German official with military forces to maintain order. A handful of Germans, never more than a few hundred officials and officers, ruled over millions of Africans through a system of indirect rule, using cooperative chiefs as intermediaries. Infrastructure development began. The first railway from Tanga inland was started. Telegraph lines connected major stations. Forts became administrative centres. Missionaries established stations, mixing evangelization with education and healthcare. Settlers began arriving, claiming land for plantations. But German control remained superficial outside main centres. Much of the interior saw Germans rarely. Traditional life continued with modifications, paying taxes, providing porters and labour when demanded, accepting German-appointed chiefs. Africans adapted to the new reality while maintaining as much autonomy as possible. The conquest phase was over. German East Africa existed not just on paper, but on the ground, maintained by force and fear. What came next would determine whether Germans could transform military conquest into stable colonial rule, or whether the resentments built during these bloody years would explode into renewed resistance. The answer would come in the 20th century's first decade, in an uprising that would shake German colonialism to its foundations. With military conquest complete, Germany faced a new challenge: making the colony profitable. The conquest had been expensive and German taxpayers demanded returns on their investment. Colonial officials set about extracting wealth from the territory through plantations, forced labour and heavy taxation. They implemented policies designed to transform African societies, breaking traditional systems and forcing Africans into the colonial economy. Missionaries arrived in greater numbers, seeking to remake African souls while German officials remade African bodies into labourers. For Africans, the brutality of conquest gave way to the grinding oppression of colonial administration. The result was resentment that smouldered for years before exploding in the largest anti-colonial uprising in German Africa's history. By 1900, German East Africa had a functioning colonial administration. The governor, based in Dar es Salaam, which replaced Bagamoyo as capital in 1891, ruled with near absolute authority. Below him, district officers, Bezirksamtmänner, governed vast territories with minimal staff and limited resources. These men were judge, tax collector, police chief, and military commander combined. The system relied on African intermediaries. German-appointed chiefs, called Akida on the coast and Jumba inland, collected taxes, recruited labour, and maintained order. Many were outsiders imposed on communities, lacking traditional legitimacy. Some were former soldiers or traders, chosen for their willingness to serve German interests rather than their standing in local society. This created tensions between appointed chiefs and traditional leaders, fragmenting African political authority. German rule was maintained by the Schutztruppe protection force, a small professional military force of German officers commanding African soldiers, askari. Never more than 3,000 strong, the Schutztruppe relied on superior firepower and mobility. Forts and garrisons dotted the territory, connected by telegraph lines that allowed rapid response to disturbances. The threat of military violence, backed by memories of the conquest, kept most Africans compliant most of the time. Germany wanted profitable exports. Coffee, cotton, rubber and sisal were identified as suitable crops. but plantations required land and labour, both in African hands. Germans used multiple methods to obtain both. Land alienation began systematically. Germans declared unused land as crown property, ignoring African customary rights. Communities found their grazing lands, fallow fields and forests seized. Settlers, mostly Germans but also Greeks and Indians, were granted large estates at minimal cost. By 1914, Germans controlled over 1 million hectares of the best agricultural land. Labour was obtained through coercion masked as law. Hut taxes, payable only in German currency, forced Africans into the cash economy. Since few Africans had cash, they had to work for wages, usually on German plantations or infrastructure projects. Tax defaulters faced imprisonment or corporal punishment. Each adult male owed labour service, corvée, to the state, theoretically limited but often exceeded. The Kapande system required all adult Africans to carry identification passes showing tax payments and labour obligations. Failure to produce a Kapande meant immediate arrest. This system controlled movement, prevented Africans from escaping labour obligations, and reinforced racial hierarchy. Germans never carried Kapandes. Plantation conditions were harsh. Workers laboured long hours under brutal overseers, often receiving inadequate food and shelter. Beatings were routine for slow work or perceived disobedience. The kiboko, hippopotamus hide whip, became the symbol of German rule, its crack echoing across plantations and administrative offices. African workers had no legal recourse against abusive employers. The Southern Highlands experienced particularly oppressive policies. Governor Count Gustav Adolf von Goetzen, 1901-1906, initiated an aggressive cotton cultivation program. Officials forced entire villages to plant cotton on communal plots, with quotas enforced by appointed chiefs. This wasn't voluntary cash crop adoption, it was compulsory labour. Cotton devastated food security. Villages were required to allocate their best land to cotton, reducing food crop area. Cotton demanded intensive labour during planting and harvest seasons that coincided with food crop needs. Families struggled to feed themselves while meeting cotton quotas. Prices paid for cotton were minimal, barely covering the hut tax, leaving no profit for the labour invested. The system's arbitrariness increased resentment. Appointed chiefs enforcing quotas without traditional authority used coercion. They beat tax defaulters, seized property, and sexually exploited women. Germans rarely intervened. They judged chiefs by cotton deliveries, not justice. Traditional leaders who objected were removed, creating political chaos. Religious factors compounded grievances. Many southern peoples practiced traditional religions or were recent Muslim converts. German policies seemed designed to destroy their way of life, seizing land for settlers, prohibiting ceremonies, forcing labour that prevented proper farming. Missionaries' presence, though they sometimes criticised colonial officials, reinforced the sense that Germans wanted to remake African societies completely. German missionaries arrived in large numbers after pacification. Catholics, Lutherans, and Moravians established mission stations across the territory. Their primary goal was evangelization, but they served colonial interests in multiple ways. Missions provided education, though limited and focused on creating compliant workers and servants. Reading, writing, and arithmetic were taught, but advanced education was rare. The curriculum emphasized Christian virtue, obedience to authority, and European cultural superiority. Mission schools produced clerks, interpreters, and catechists, an African auxiliary class for colonial administration. Medical care was another mission function. Hospitals and dispensaries attracted Africans, providing entry points for conversion. Medical treatment was often conditional on attending services or sending children to mission schools. While missionaries saved lives, they also used African vulnerability to advance their religious agenda. Missionaries had complex relationships with colonial officials. Some criticized brutal policies, defending African rights. Others collaborated enthusiastically, believing German rule would facilitate evangelization by breaking traditional societies and opening them to Christianity. Many justified colonialism theologically, seeing it as God's plan to spread the gospel. African responses to Christianity varied. Some converted genuinely, finding meaning in Christian teachings or attracted by mission schools and hospitals. Others converted superficially to gain access to these services or avoid official suspicion. Many maintained traditional beliefs privately while outwardly conforming to Christianity. The result was a complex religious landscape where Christianity, Islam, and traditional religions coexisted, competed, and sometimes blended. By 1904, African resentment was widespread. The southern regions especially seethed with anger. Communities had lost land, autonomy, and dignity. Young men laboured on plantations far from home. Women worked cotton fields while struggling to feed their families. Elders saw traditional authority eroded by German-appointed upstarts. Small acts of resistance proliferated. Tax evasion became common, with people hiding in the bush during collection periods. Labour conscription was evaded through migration or feigning illness. Appointed chiefs faced ostracism or threats. Anonymous violence occurred. Fires destroyed colonial property, tools disappeared, crops were sabotaged. The German response was, predictably, harsh. Collective punishment was standard. Villages suspected of harbouring tax evaders were fined, their chiefs imprisoned, their young men conscripted as punishment. This created vicious cycles where resistance provoked repression, which provoked more resistance. In this climate of fear and anger, prophets and spirit mediums began circulating. They spoke of ancestors' displeasure, of spirits demanding action against the foreigners. Traditional religious leaders, marginalized by colonial rule, found audiences for their messages. Something was stirring in the Southern Highlands, a spiritual and political movement that would soon challenge German rule more fundamentally than any previous rebellion. By mid-1905, German East Africa appeared stable on the surface. The Schutztruppe maintained order, taxes were collected, plantations operated, railways expanded. German officials congratulated themselves on civilizing the colony. But beneath this facade, African societies were fracturing under colonial pressure. The grievances were accumulating, the resentment deepening, and the spark that would ignite the explosion was about to be struck. In July 1905, something extraordinary happened in the southern highlands of German East Africa. Across vast territories, diverse ethnic groups that had never cooperated before suddenly united in rebellion against German rule. Warriors attacked colonial stations, plantations, and missions. They fought with courage bordering on suicidal, believing sacred water, magi, would turn German bullets into water. The Meiji-Maji Uprising, named for this water medicine, became the largest anti-colonial rebellion in German Africa. For 2 years, Germans fought to suppress it, employing scorched earth tactics that caused a humanitarian catastrophe. When it ended, perhaps 300,000 Africans were dead, mostly from starvation. The rebellion failed to expel the Germans, but it forced changes in colonial policy and left a legacy of resistance that would inspire future independence movements. The rebellion began with a prophet. Kinjekitile Ngwale, a spirit medium from the Matumbi Hills, claimed possession by the snake spirit Hongo. In early 1905, he began dispensing maji, water, mixed with millet and other ingredients, telling people who drank it that they would be immune to German bullets. The bullets would turn to water, unable to harm believers. This wasn't mere superstition. Kinjekitile understood African grievances deeply and created a unifying ideology that transcended ethnic divisions. The Maji medicine became a symbol of unity and resistance. By drinking it, diverse peoples, Matumbi, Ngindo, Ngoni, Pogoro, and others, joined a common cause. The water ceremony created bonds between communities that had previously been rivals or strangers. Kinjekitile's message was both spiritual and political. he declared that ancestors demanded action against the Germans. The foreigners had disrupted the natural order, stolen land, and forced people into degrading labour. Only by expelling them could balance be restored. His theology blended traditional beliefs with elements borrowed from Christianity and Islam, creating something new and powerful. By mid-1905, thousands had taken the Magi medicine. Secret networks spread the movement across the southern regions. Warriors prepared weapons, stockpiling spears, arrows, and a few firearms. Chiefs who had resisted German control coordinated plans. The explosion was imminent. On July 31, 1905, Matumbi warriors attacked the cotton fields they had been forced to cultivate, destroying the hated crop. Within days, attacks spread across the southern highlands. Colonial stations were overrun, their small garrisons killed. Plantations were burned, their owners and overseers murdered. Mission stations were destroyed, missionaries killed or forced to flee. The rebels' initial success was stunning. German control evaporated over vast areas. Towns like Colossa and Livala fell. The Schutztruppe, caught unprepared and spread thin, couldn't respond effectively. For weeks it seemed possible that the rebellion might succeed in expelling Germans entirely from the south. The rebels fought with extraordinary courage. Warriors charged German positions, chanting and calling on the Magi to protect them. When bullets cut them down, survivors believed the fallen had sinned or hadn't followed rituals properly. The faith in the water medicine, rather than protecting warriors, ensured they kept fighting despite horrific casualties. At Mahenge in August 1905, over 5,000 rebels attacked a fortified position defended by fewer than 100 Germans and Askari with machine guns. The rebels charged repeatedly, each wave cut down by withering fire. Hundreds died, but they kept coming. When the battle ended, German defenders were shaken by the rebels' fanaticism and courage, even as they counted over 1,000 rebel dead. Governor Gustav Adolf von Goetzen recognised the uprising's severity and authorised extreme measures. Reinforcements were rushed from Germany and other colonies. The Schutztruppe's strength doubled, then tripled. Naval vessels bombarded coastal rebel areas. But military force alone couldn't suppress the rebellion quickly. General Alfred von Trotha, cousin of the general who committed genocide in German Southwest Africa, implemented a deliberate starvation campaign. German forces systematically destroyed crops, granaries, and livestock. Villages were burned. Wells were poisoned. People found with food were shot as rebel supporters. The goal was to make continued resistance impossible by destroying the material basis for survival. This scorched earth policy was genocidal in effect, if not intent. The 1906 harvest failed in rebel areas because fields couldn't be planted or tended. By 1907, famine gripped the south. Desperate people ate roots, tree bark, and anything remotely edible. Diseases, dysentery, smallpox, typhus, ravaged populations weakened by hunger. Entire villages died. Survivors fled to the bush or tried surrendering to Germans, who often shot them anyway, or sent them to concentration camps where conditions were little better than starvation. German forces also employed African auxiliaries from northern tribes, traditional enemies of southern peoples. These Askari fought ruthlessly, their ethnic animosities exploited by Germans. Villages suspected of supporting rebels were massacred. The elderly, women and children weren't spared. German officers encouraged brutality, believing only terror would end the rebellion. By late 1906, the rebellion was collapsing. Kinjekitile was captured and hanged in August 1905, his death a severe blow to rebel morale. Without central leadership, the uprising fragmented into local resistances. The Magi's failure to stop bullets was undeniable. Chiefs who had joined the rebellion began seeking accommodation, or were hunted down and killed. Some groups fought on desperately. The Ngoni, renowned warriors, resisted until 1907, their mountain strongholds providing temporary refuge. But German superiority in weapons, logistics, and ruthlessness was overwhelming. One by one, rebel groups were defeated, their survivors scattered or dead. The human cost was catastrophic. Modern estimates suggest between 200,000 and 300,000 Africans died, roughly 1/3 of the southern region's population. Most died not in battle, but from starvation and disease caused by German scorched earth tactics. Entire landscapes were depopulated, skulls and bones littered abandoned villages. Wildlife reclaimed areas humans had inhabited for generations. German casualties were minimal, perhaps 400 soldiers killed, including African askari. But the economic cost was enormous. The colonial budget was bankrupted. Plantations were destroyed. Infrastructure was damaged. The rebellion had nearly bankrupted German East Africa financially, even as it devastated the colony demographically. The Maji-Maji uprising failed to expel the Germans, but it succeeded in other ways. It forced policy changes that slightly improved colonial governance. It demonstrated African agency and resistance capacity. It created heroes and martyrs whose memory inspired future generations. When Tanzania gained independence in 1961, Maji-Maji was celebrated as the first war of liberation, proof that Tanzanians had always resisted colonialism. The rebellion also revealed German colonialism's true nature. The rhetoric of civilization and development masked a system of ruthless exploitation maintained by violence. The Scorched Earth campaign showed how far Germans would go to maintain control. Maji-Maji removed any pretense that colonialism was benevolent. For German East Africa, the uprising marked a turning point. The colony would never again face such widespread rebellion. But the trauma lingered on both sides. Germans governed with heightened suspicion and readiness for violence. Africans learned bitter lessons about resistance and survival under colonial rule. The water war was over, but its consequences shaped the colony's remaining years. The Maji-Maji uprising shocked Germany. Reports of the famine reached the Reichstag, where critics questioned colonial policies. The Social Democratic Party condemned the atrocities, though their influence was limited. Nevertheless, Berlin recognized that policy changes were necessary. Governor von Götzen was replaced in 1906 by Freiherr von Rechenberg, who implemented reforms. Corporal punishment was restricted, though not eliminated. The cotton cultivation program, a primary grievance, was ended. More attention was paid to African welfare, at least nominally. Education and healthcare investments increased. The most brutal district officers were removed. But these reforms were limited. German rule remained fundamentally exploitative and racist. Forced labour continued under different guises. Land alienation accelerated as settlers claimed depopulated areas. The Schutztruppe remained the ultimate authority, violence always implicit in colonial governance. For Africans, Maji-Maji became a powerful memory. It demonstrated that unified resistance was possible, even if unsuccessful. The rebellion's failure showed that German military power couldn't be overcome with traditional weapons. Future resistance would need different strategies. But the courage and sacrifice of those who fought and died became part of a resistance tradition that would eventually culminate in independence movements decades later. After the catastrophe of Maji-Maji, Germany attempted a new approach in East Africa. The brutal military governance that had provoked rebellion gave way to what officials called ethical colonialism, development projects, welfare programs, and reduced corporal punishment. Railways expanded across the territory. Schools and hospitals multiplied. Economic output grew steadily. On the surface, German East Africa seemed to be maturing into a stable, prosperous colony. But beneath this facade of progress, fundamental injustices remained. Land alienation continued, forced labour persisted under new names, and racial hierarchy was reinforced through increasingly elaborate regulations. The reform years improved colonial administration but didn't fundamentally change its exploitative nature. And then, in 1914, European madness arrived in Africa, transforming the colony into a battlefield. Governor Albrecht Freiherr von Rechenberg, 1906–1912, represented a new colonial philosophy. A career administrator rather than a military man, he believed efficient, rational governance would be more profitable than brute force. His reforms aimed to make colonialism sustainable and less resistance-prone. Corporal punishment was restricted, though not eliminated. The Kiboko whip remained but couldn't be applied without documentation and medical oversight. District officers who beat Africans excessively faced discipline, a change from previous impunity. Forced labour for private plantations was officially ended, though corvée labour for public works continued. Taxation remained heavy, but was more systematically administered with clearer appeals processes. Rechenberg promoted African cash crop farming, rather than just plantation agriculture. He encouraged Africans to grow coffee, cotton and other exports on their own land, reasoning that prosperous African farmers would be more stable and less rebellious than dispossessed labourers. This was enlightened by colonial standards but still served German interests. African farmers paid taxes and bought German goods. Healthcare and education expanded significantly. Mission hospitals received government subsidies. Secular schools opened in major towns, though education remained limited and designed to produce clerks and artisans, not intellectuals. Literacy increased modestly, creating a small African-educated class that would later play crucial roles in independence movements. But settler interests remained paramount. German settlers, never numbering more than 5,000, controlled vast estates and wielded disproportionate political influence. They opposed Rechenberg's African-friendly policies, fearing competition from African farmers and losing cheap labour access. Political battles in Dar es Salaam and Berlin pitted reform-minded administrator against settler lobbies, demanding continued privileges. By 1914, German East Africa was economically viable, finally justifying its existence to sceptical German taxpayers. Sisal, introduced in the 1890s, became the colony's most valuable export. German estates produced high-quality sisal fibre used for rope and twine. Coffee from the Kilimanjaro region gained international reputation. Cotton production recovered after forced cultivation ended, with African farmers voluntarily growing it at good prices. Rubber, extracted from wild vines, created brief fortunes for those who could exploit African labour. The rubber boom, roughly 1900–1913, saw brutal practices as traders forced Africans to collect rubber quotas, mirroring horrors in Belgian Congo. When rubber prices collapsed, the boom ended, but it had demonstrated colonialism's capacity for ruthless exploitation, even during reform years. Mining began contributing significantly. Gold discoveries in the Lake Victoria region attracted prospectors. Diamonds were found near Shinyanga. These weren't massive deposits like South African mines, but they added to export revenues and attracted investment. German companies dominated mining, though Indian and Arab merchants participated in trading networks. Indian merchants became economically crucial. Thousands of Indians, mostly from Gujarat, immigrated as traders, moneylenders and craftsmen. They connected German wholesalers with African consumers, advanced credit to African farmers, and processed crops. Their economic role created racial tensions. Europeans resented Indian competition. Africans resented Indian moneylenders' terms, while Indians occupied an uncomfortable middle position in the racial hierarchy. Nothing transformed German East Africa more than railways. The central line from Dar es Salaam to Kigoma on Lake Tanganyika, 254 km, was completed in 1914 after 14 years of construction. The Usambara line connected Tanga to the interior. These railways opened previously inaccessible regions to trade and administration. Construction was brutal. Thousands of African workers, recruited through corvée labour, died from disease, exhaustion and accidents. Dysentery, malaria, and other tropical diseases ravaged labour camps. Safety standards were minimal. Workers who fled faced imprisonment. The railway's human cost rivaled Maji-Maji's, though deaths were spread over years rather than concentrated in famine. But the railways worked. Transport cost plummeted. Coffee from Kilimanjaro, cotton from the interior, and sisal from coastal plantations could reach ports economically. The journey that took weeks by porter-caravan now took days by train. Telegraph lines parallel to railways enabled rapid communication. German control became more effective as troops and officials could deploy quickly to trouble spots. Railways also facilitated European settlement. Land along rail lines became valuable, attracting settlers who established farms and plantations. Towns emerged at rail stations, Morogoro, Tabora, Mwanza. These became administrative centres, their African populations growing as people sought wage labour or trading opportunities. Urbanisation accelerated, disrupting traditional rural societies but creating new economic possibilities. As the colony stabilised, racial segregation became more elaborate. Germans occupied the apex, followed by other Europeans and Indians, with Africans at the bottom. This hierarchy was legally codified through numerous regulations. Residential segregation concentrated Europeans in separate quarters with better sanitation and housing. Africans lived in crowded, unsanitary native quarters. Public facilities were segregated. Railways had European and native classes, the latter overcrowded and uncomfortable. Hotels, restaurants and clubs excluded non-Europeans. Legal systems reinforced inequality. Europeans were tried in different courts, with more lenient standards than Africans facing the same charges. Africans accused of crimes against Europeans faced harsh punishment, while Europeans who assaulted or killed Africans rarely faced consequences. The notorious case of a German settler who beat his servant to death, receiving only a fine, exemplified this disparity. Labour regulations institutionalised exploitation. Wage minimums for Africans were far below European wages for similar work. Contracts bound African workers to employers for months or years, with desertion punishable by imprisonment. Employers could physically punish workers for poor performance. These weren't slavery technically, but they created conditions of near bondage. German cultural institutions flourished. Dar es Salaam gained German clubs, a theatre, and a brewery. Settlers established communities replicating German village life with festivals and customs. German architecture appeared. The famous Boma administrative building, in Dar es Salaam, railway stations in Germanic style, churches and schools reflecting German aesthetic preferences. But African culture persisted and adapted. Traditional ceremonies continued despite mission opposition. Music and dance incorporated new elements while maintaining core identities. Swahili emerged as a lingua franca, facilitating communication across ethnic groups. The language absorbed German loanwords but remained fundamentally African. Resistance continued in subtle forms. Tax evasion, labour contract violations and minor sabotage occurred regularly. Some Africans used colonial courts strategically, manipulating legal systems to advance their interests. The educated elite, though small, began articulating grievances in terms Germans claimed to respect: rights, justice, development. This wasn't open rebellion but persistent low-level resistance. By mid-1914, German East Africa seemed stable and prosperous. The railway connected the interior to the coast. Exports were growing. The administration functioned efficiently. Settler population was increasing. German officials congratulated themselves on having civilized the colony after the Maji-Maji disaster. But resentments remained deep. Land alienation continued, with the best land in German hands. Forced labour, though reformed, still extracted African labour without adequate compensation. Racial discrimination was pervasive and humiliating. The educated African elite, growing slowly, saw the contradiction between German claims of bringing civilization and the reality of exploitation and contempt. Then, in August 1914, news arrived that Europe was at war. Germany was fighting Britain, France, and Russia. This European conflict seemed distant from East African concerns, but the colony's borders adjoined British colonies, Kenya, Uganda, Nyasaland, Northern Rhodesia, and Belgian Congo. Colonial officials and settlers wondered, would the war remain in Europe, or would it spread to Africa? The answer came quickly. Britain's Royal Navy blockaded the coast. British and Belgian forces mobilised near borders. German settlers organised volunteer units. The Schutztruppe, professional and well-trained, prepared for defence. German East Africa, peaceful after years of consolidation, was about to become a battlefield in a war not of Africans' making, but in which Africans would suffer and die in enormous numbers. World War I transformed German East Africa from colonial backwater into one of the war's most extraordinary theatres. For 4 years, a small German force under the brilliant and ruthless Colonel Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck fought a guerrilla campaign against vastly superior British, Belgian, and Portuguese forces. The campaign became legendary. Lettow-Vorbeck never surrendered, continuing to fight even after Germany's defeat in Europe. But the true story wasn't German heroism, it was African tragedy. Over 1 million Africans died as porters, soldiers, or civilians caught in the war's destruction. Villages were burned, crops destroyed, diseases spread unchecked. When it ended, German East Africa was devastated, its people traumatized, and German colonialism in Africa was finished forever. Lieutenant Colonel, later Colonel, Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck commanded the Schutztruppe when war began. A professional soldier with experience in colonial wars, he immediately recognized that conventional defense was impossible. The Royal Navy controlled the seas, cutting off reinforcements and supplies. British forces in Kenya and Uganda, Belgian forces in Congo, and Portuguese in Mozambique surrounded the colony. Lettow-Vorbeck couldn't win, but he could tie down Allied forces that would otherwise fight in Europe. His strategy was brilliant guerrilla warfare. Rather than defend fixed positions, he kept his force mobile, striking British supply lines and retreating before superior forces could engage. He captured weapons and supplies from defeated British columns, living off the enemy. His force, never larger than 15,000, mostly African Askari with German officers, fought a British force that eventually exceeded 300,000. Lettow-Vorbeck understood African terrain and used it masterfully. The vast distances, difficult topography, and tropical diseases favoured defenders. British forces, mostly Indian and African troops from other colonies, struggled with unfamiliar conditions. Malaria, dysentery, and sleeping sickness killed more Allied soldiers than combat. Supply lines stretched hundreds of kilometres through roadless wilderness, requiring enormous numbers of porters. The Askari proved extraordinarily loyal and effective. These African soldiers, many recruited before the war, fought for Germany with discipline and courage. Why? Some were motivated by military pride and esprit de corps. Others were coerced. Deserters faced execution. Many simply followed their officers, having no particular loyalty to Britain either. The Askari became legendary, though their story is more complex than German propaganda suggested. The war began badly for Germany. The Royal Navy bombarded coastal towns, destroying the harbour at Dar es Salaam. British forces captured German positions in northern border areas. The Germans' cruiser Königsberg, trapped in the Rufiji River Delta, was destroyed in 1915. German East Africa was cut off from the outside world, but Lettow-Vorbeck's inland strategy succeeded. In November 1914, at Tanga, a British invasion force of 8,000 was disastrously defeated by fewer than 1,000 Germans and Askari. The Battle of Tanga became a humiliation for Britain, demonstrating German forces' competence and British command incompetence. British forces retreated, leaving behind weapons and supplies the Germans desperately needed. For the next 2 years, the war was a series of raids, ambushes, and small battles. German columns appeared unexpectedly, destroyed British installations, and vanished. British forces, under commanders who underestimated their opponent, stumbled through unsuccessful offensives. By 1916, Britain recognised this required serious effort and appointed General Jan Smuts, South African war hero, to command. Smuts launched a massive offensive in early 1916 with over 100,000 troops. Unlike previous commanders, he had resources and determination to crush German resistance. Under relentless pressure, Letto Vorbeck retreated south, fighting delaying actions but avoiding decisive battle. The Germans evacuated major towns. Dar es Salaam fell in September 1916, Tabora in August 1916. By year's end, Germans controlled only the southern region. The war's greatest tragedy was the porter system. Armies in roadless Africa required enormous numbers of porters to carry supplies. Every bullet, every ration, every piece of equipment had to be carried by human labour. British forces needed roughly 1 porter for every 2 soldiers. German forces, living off the land more, still needed thousands. Both sides conscripted porters through force. Young men were rounded up, given minimal rations and no pay, and forced to carry crushing loads through disease-infested wilderness. Conditions were horrific. Porters died from exhaustion, starvation, disease, and violence. Deserters were shot. The sick were abandoned. Estimates suggest over 100,000 porters died in British service alone, possibly many more. The human cost extended beyond porters. Villages in the war zone were destroyed by both sides. German forces burned villages suspected of aiding the British. British forces destroyed crops to deny German supplies. Civilians fled into the bush, where disease and starvation killed thousands. Women and children suffered disproportionately, as men were taken as porters or soldiers. Famine struck areas where crops couldn't be planted or harvested due to military operations. The 1918-1919 influenza pandemic hit populations weakened by malnutrition. Sleeping sickness, spread by tsetse flies in areas where people concentrated as refugees, killed tens of thousands. Smallpox and other diseases raged unchecked as medical systems collapsed. Total African deaths from the East African campaign are estimated at 750,000 to over 1 million. This exceeded Maji-Maji's death toll and devastated the region demographically. Many deaths occurred after fighting ended, as famine and disease continued into 1919-1920. By 1917, Letto Vorbeck controlled only a small area of southeastern German East Africa. British forces finally sealed the borders with Kenya and Belgian Congo. Rather than surrender, Letto Vorbeck made a desperate decision: invade Portuguese Mozambique, live off Portuguese supplies, and continue fighting indefinitely. In November 1917, German forces crossed into Mozambique. Portuguese colonial forces, poorly equipped and led, collapsed. For the next year, Germans raided through Mozambique, capturing food, weapons, and supplies. They briefly re-entered German East Africa in 1918 before retreating again into Mozambique, then continued south into northern Rhodesia, Zambia. The campaign had no strategic purpose. Germany's position was hopeless, the war in Europe nearly over. Letto Vorbeck fought out of stubbornness, pride, or perhaps madness. His force dwindled through desertion, disease, and combat. By November 1918, he commanded perhaps 300 Germans and Askari, a ghost of the original Schutztruppe. On November 13th, 1918, 2 days after the armistice in Europe, Letto Vorbeck learned Germany had surrendered. He finally agreed to cease hostilities, marching his force to Abercorn, northern Rhodesia, where they formally surrendered on November 25th. He was the only German colonial commander never defeated in battle, a fact celebrated in Germany and lamented by the Allies. The Treaty of Versailles formally ended German colonial rule. German East Africa was partitioned. Britain received Tanganyika, the mainland territory. Belgium received Rwanda and Burundi. Portugal received the Kionga Triangle. Germany's African empire, acquired in the 1880s, was completely liquidated by 1920. For Africans, German rule's end brought mixed feelings. German brutality was replaced by British, Belgian, or Portuguese rule. Different overlords, similar exploitation. Some Africans, especially former Askari, felt loyalty to their German officers and resented British victory. Others welcomed German defeat, hoping for improvement under new rulers. Most simply wanted the killing and destruction to end. The war traumatized the colony. The demographic catastrophe took decades to recover from. Infrastructure was destroyed. The economy collapsed. Famine and disease continued into the 1920s. British rule, rebranded as a League of Nations mandate, brought different administrative practices but maintained colonial exploitation. In Germany, Leto Vorbeck became a national hero, the undefeated commander who tied down superior Allied forces. His memoirs became bestsellers. Nazi Germany later celebrated him as an example of German martial virtue. The reality, that his campaign's primary achievement was African suffering on a massive scale, was conveniently forgotten. German East Africa existed for 34 years, from 1885 to 1919. It was conquered through violence, administered through coercion, and destroyed by a war Africans didn't start. Germany left behind railways, some buildings, and a legacy of traumatic memories. They also left behind the Swahili language's spread as an administrative and military lingua franca, inadvertently helping create the linguistic unity that would later facilitate Tanzanian nationalism. The colony's history challenges colonial apologists who claim European rule brought civilization. German East Africa demonstrated colonialism's essential brutality. The Maji-Maji genocide, the forced labour system, the racial contempt, the war's casual destruction of African lives for European strategic purposes. Any economic development occurred through African suffering and for European benefit. Yet African societies survived. They endured conquest, rebellion, famine, war, and disease. They maintained cultural identities, adapted to colonial pressures, and preserved memories of resistance. When independence came in the 1960s, Tanzanians, Rwandans, and Burundians could look back at German rule as proof that they had always resisted foreign domination and would never accept it again. The German East African story ended in 1919, but its consequences echo through the present. The borders drawn by Germans and modified by the Treaty of Versailles remain largely unchanged. The infrastructure built by forced labour still shapes development patterns. The ethnic tensions Germans exploited continue affecting politics, and the memory of resistance, from Abushiri to Mkwawa to the Askari who fought for 4 years, inspires those who believe small nations and peoples can stand against great powers, however terrible the cost.